My name is Lauren Tuckley, and I am the director of the the Center for Research and Fellowships, and I am delighted today to introduce 4 fellows for our second panel representing the Davis, Raines, and Provost Undergraduate Research Fellowships. Our first panelist, Nandi Dubé, the Royden B. Davis Fellow. The Davis Fellowship honors Father Davis, Dean of Georgetown College from 1966 to 1989. The fellowship named in his honor supports summer research that employ the imagination through transformative experiences that ask tough questions, discern meaning, and serve others.
My name is Lauren Tuckley. Today, I'm presenting my research on empathy and health. So, if you ask anybody in my family, they will tell you that I am a redneck. I know, sounds kind of shocking, but I'm the first and only person in my family to be born in the United States. Both of my parents are African immigrants. My father is from Malawi, and my mother is from Ghana. So I've always had the classic first-generation American problem of where do I fit in? Am I Ghanaian? Am I Malawian? Am I American? Am I a blend of all three? When I came to Georgetown, I began to think about my research interests, my passions, and my career goals. I knew that I wanted to do work that honored my identity and honored my interest in helping people. One of the ways I've done that is through the BLESS Research Group. BLESS stands for the Black Early Stages of Social and Mental Development. We are a group of psychology researchers dedicated to improving mental health outcomes for Black children and families in this area. I applied to the lab last year. When I was looking through their lab website, I saw a few things that really caught my eye. One of which was their global engagement and group connection with Ghana. One of the organizations they work with is Africa's Mental Health Matters. Africa's Mental Health Matters is a nonprofit organization whose initiative focuses on dispelling mental health misconceptions in Africa and promoting mental health awareness amongst young adults. They do this through social media campaigns, emotional support groups, and annual conferences. We worked with them to develop our global partnership and to inform our research. Of particular importance to us throughout this whole process has been cultural humility. We wanted a partner who was well acquainted with our target population, who could help us approach our work mindfully and respectfully. So our research question is as follows. What factors contribute to young adult mental health stigma in Ghana, and what practices can we implement to lessen the stigma? So our research has taken place in 2 primary phases. The first being the qualitative research phase. Africa's Mental Health Matters helped us to recruit 18 total participants, 9 providers of mental health care, so psychologists, psychiatrists, mental health nurses, and 9 consumers of mental health care, so people who utilize mental health services. We conducted semi-structured virtual interviews with participants that ranged anywhere from 1 to 2 hours. We asked them questions regarding mental health stigma, resources, access to care, and perceived barriers to mental health care. We also asked them demographics questions, questions about religion, gender, childhood experiences, things like that. So we organized our findings into 4 main categories with 4 A's. The first being acceptability. So acceptability refers to the lack of acceptance of mental health issues. We also organized it further into sub-themes. The first sub-theme was stigma, which was the main sub-theme that we found. Stigma refers to the shame, ostracization, and judgment faced by those who seek out mental health care resources. Religion also played a huge factor in the acceptability piece. Almost all of our participants were religious, with most being Christian and a few being Muslim. And a lot of people had somewhat antiquated beliefs about mental health and religion, with the most common belief being that mental health issues are a result of demonic obsession. One of the other sub-themes under acceptability was gender bias. We found that men were a lot less likely to seek care for mental illnesses, and that there was an expectation for men to be emotionally strong and to not be vulnerable. The next A was accessibility. So this refers to the ability for people to receive care. We found that cost was an extremely large barrier to receiving care because mental health services are not covered under Ghana's national insurance. We also found that the unavailability of resources was a huge issue. There's not a lot of specialized care for teenagers and young adults, and also there's not enough psychological providers for the population of Ghana. Accountability was our next A. This refers to the experiences that consumers had with providers. So the two main issues we found here were a lack of confidentiality and therapists imposing their own biases and judgments onto consumers. There were some positives to this aspect, though. Some people found that their opinions of therapy and psychology shifted once they started to receive psychological services. Final A was accommodations. So these are proposed solutions for addressing Ghana's mental health stigma issue. So the two main solutions that people brought forth were to increase education for parents and teachers and to collaborate with spiritual leaders. So the next phase of our research was traveling to Ghana. So I received funds from the Roy B. Davis Fellowship, and I was able to travel to Ghana with the rest of my lab. So our trip had three main components: professional conference, site visits, and argument seminar. The professional conference had 50 attendees, and these were mental health workers and general healthcare workers, so pharmacists, psychologists, psychiatrists, doctors, and we presented our research, so those 4 A's that I just talked about. And we also had a keynote speaker, Dr. Annabella Osei Tutu from the University of Ghana, who talked about her collaboration with spiritual leaders for scientifically informed counseling practices. We also had a panel discussion with some US psychologists, Dr. Osei Tutu, and the founder of Africa's Mental Health Matters, Vanessa Adebayo. We also had small group discussions that were informed by our research. So we had 3 main topics that participants could choose from: faith-based stigma, cultural and familial stigma, and medical stigma. The next phase of the trip was the site visits. So we visited 2 schools. The first was the Ghana International School, which is a primary and secondary school. We met with their vice president of the secondary school. She told us about their counseling center, how students are able to access free anonymous psychological services. She shared with us some of the dialogues that they have with students to encourage people to talk about mental health and to overall reduce stigma. She also shared with us some of the ways that they protect teachers' mental health through free counseling and discussions about anxiety and burnout. We also met with the University of Ghana's Counseling Center. She told us about the student resources they offer there, free counseling, free access to psychiatric medications. She also told us about the school's initiatives to encourage students to invest in their mental health. Final phase was our youth seminar. This was informed by our community advisory board, which was a group of graduate students at the University of Ghana who advised us on potential topics and how we should organize today, and then also by our research. We had 56 attendees, undergraduate and graduate students from the University of Ghana and other universities in the area. We had town hall discussions where people could share stories and ask questions about their mental health struggles. People also asked questions about pretty broad topics like community, hope, friendship, things of that nature. And we also had group discussions similar to those professional conference, with these 4 topics being informed by our community advisory board. These were anxiety and depression related to academic concerns, intimate partner violence, sexual assault and coercion, and drug abuse. So we took our trip and we now have a few next steps. The first is to contribute to the body of literature on Ghanaian mental health stigma through the paper that we'll be writing about our qualitative findings and also the trip we took. We also wish to continue our partnership with Africa's Mental Health Matters, the Ghana International School, and the University of Ghana. One of the main comments that we got when we were taking this trip was that people didn't want this to just be a one-time thing. People wanted us to continue our collaboration, to continue coming back to Ghana, and to continue this work. And one of the professors on the trip said something to me that really stuck with me. The point of doing all this research is that data creates urgency. So the more people who are talking about mental health stigma, the more people who are publishing, starting these professional conversations, the more we'll be able to disseminate this information to the broader public and to other researchers. So I just wanted to thank Bless Lab, my PI, Dr. Coates, the Roy B. Davis Fellowship, and thank you to you all for listening to me today.
Thank you, Nandi. The next research project comes to us from Jasmine Alas Castillo and Daniela Arevalo, juniors in the SFS and the college, who work together as Lisa J. Raines Fellows. Lisa Raines graduated from Georgetown Law in 1982 and was a leader in the biotechnology field, seeking to advance treatments for cancer, HIV/AIDS, and rare diseases. She perished on September 11th, 2001, aboard American Airlines Flight 77. And this fellowship at Georgetown honors her legacy and steadfast work to contribute to the common good. During the summer, Raines Fellows conduct independent research and participate in a weekly seminar. Jasmine, Daniela, we invite you to share your project with us.
Hi, everybody, and welcome to our talk on bridging the spaces between writing centers and low-income first generation educators. My name is Daniela, and I'm a junior in the college, double majoring in linguistics and English. And as was just said, both of us were Raines Fellows.
Hi everyone, my name is Jasmine Alas Castillo. I'm a junior in the SFS, majoring in regional Latin American studies and minoring in education. And Daniela and I have both been writing center tutors at Georgetown's Writing Center for the past year, and we're also both part of the Georgetown Scholars Program, which is Georgetown's program for first generation low-income students. Before we begin, we'd like to clarify that in our work, we use the term low-income, first generation, and working class to refer to all students who may be the first in their family to go to college and come from socioeconomically disadvantaged backgrounds. But for the ease of our presentation today, we'll be using the acronym FIGLY, or first generation low income, to refer to these students. And additionally, because our work is heavily rooted in our lived experiences as FIGLY tutors and being part of the Georgetown Scholars Program, we'll be referring to the GSP, which is Georgetown's program for first generation. In terms of contextualizing our research, for those who may not be aware, the Writing Center is a free undergraduate resource at universities where students are able to go meet one-on-one with trained peer tutors and work at any stage of the writing process. In terms of our presentation today, we'll first review background, then we'll head into our questions and methods. We'll then look at our findings with our 3 research questions, and then we'll conclude with our implications of our research and our work at Georgetown today.
So to get into our background, during our literature review, we found that FIGLY students at elite universities experience what the research refers to as institutional classism when they seek support from resources that universities advertise to serve quote-unquote all students. And they experience this classism when universities build their resources based off of an assumption of what the standard student looks like, typically a continuing generation, middle to upper class student, and this leaves those outside of the standard with less than adequate. Marginalized students outside of the standard, such as FIGLY ones, have been shown to take the initiative to create resources for their own communities when they feel that these university resources are not enough. By filling these gaps where universities fall short, these students are offering institutional critiques about class-normative environments on college campuses. Writing centers, being resources that universities advertise as for all students, also tailor themselves to this idea of class-normative students, what they are and what they should be. This is because it claims that it is willing and able to serve all students. However, it does not acknowledge or question the assumptions that it makes about what clients coming into the center should look like or should know. And ultimately, this failure of the Writing Center to meet FIGLY students' expectations can often result in sessions for many FIGLY students.
Considering these facts and the work of FIGLY tutors at other universities, and our work at Georgetown as FIGLY tutors, who for the past year, we've been working on projects to strengthen the presence of first-gen low-income students at our Writing Center, both as clients and tutors. We were left with the question of, are there other FIGLY tutors at other universities doing similar work? And if so, have they been successful? And how can we learn from what other universities do? In terms of what that led us to do, we began to investigate FIGLY tutor perspectives and quickly realized that FIGLY tutor perspectives are entirely missing from the body of literature in Writing Center studies. And so that led us to come up with 3 questions to center our project. The First is how do writing center operations, so hiring of tutors, the training of tutors, and tutoring itself, promote or hinder Figly success within the writing center? The second is what role do programs and staff play in the usage and advancement of Figly, the Figly usage and advancement in the center? And then lastly, how do Figly tutors perceive and navigate writing center Figly dynamics? In terms of the methods for our study, we began by looking at COFI schools. So these are schools that are all committed to meeting the full demonstrated needs of their students. And of these schools, we looked at 12 writing center tutors. We had 12 interviews with writing center tutors at 5 of the institutions. And 5 of the tutors who we interviewed were part of their universities. In terms of the limitations of our study was limited by the small sample size of 12 tutors and 5 universities represented. Additionally, we didn't observe any tutoring appointments, hiring interviews, or training sessions, so our data is limited to tutors' perspectives of the. This leads to our first question of how do writing center operations, hiring, training, tutoring, promote, or hinder Figly success within the center. In terms of our presentation today, we'll focus on our findings regarding training. In our interviews, tutors expressed that while training did mention some form of diversity, 10 out of 12 tutors reported not having any conversations about how they might work with Figly clients. Moreover, in response to our questions regarding how they might individually work with Figly clients differently than students that they are used to working with, most tutors reported not thinking about working with Figly clients or not having thought about working with Figly clients. Most tutors expressed being unaware of Figly clients' specific needs. It's important to note that these tutors were still trained on specific strategies for students, but the students that they had in mind were the standard student who comes from a middle to upper class continuing generation background. These students were taught these specific strategies under the guise of it being these students were taught these strategies under the assumption all of these practices were universal and were applicable to all students.
So moving on to our second research question, what role do programs and staff play towards Figly usage and advancement in the Writing Center? We found that fellow Figly students played a vital role in the journeys of the majority of the Figly tutors we interviewed, and they basically created a pipeline from client to tutor for these students. 4 out of 5 of the Figly tutors we interviewed reported that relationships with older peers that they made while they were in programs specifically for Figly students played a role in their decisions to eventually go on to become Writing Center tutors. And this is because Figly tutors introduced them to the Writing Center, providing positive experiences, and eventually this became a fact of deciding to apply. At our own Writing Center, we have begun to see this pipeline too. After we gave some presentations about the Writing Center at the Summer Bridge program for some of our Figly students on campus, we have seen an increase in the amount of Figly clients this fall, and we are also hoping that the increase in Figly clients we're seeing right now will eventually translate to more Figly tutors once applications open. And that brings us to our third research question on how do Figly students operate once they are becoming tutors. We found that for many of our Figly tutors, their backgrounds and experiences that drew from being first generation and low income were resources that they could actively use when they were tutoring Figly students. And this was for the ultimate benefit of their Figly clients. This is because, 1, this can be a potential point of connection and bonding, which could make clients more comfortable during sessions. And 2, as one tutor put it, coming from a background different than a typical university student, or as the research identifies, continuing generation and middle class, gave her the insight to recognize when her training she received was not enough. And it also pushed her to push new ways of coming up to help with her clients. For example, this tutor specifically came up with what she coined the term McChicken essay, and this is to explain the basic building blocks of an essay to a student who came into the Writing Center not really knowing where to start with their project. And importantly, this and other tutors who reported using unique techniques reported that they had clients constantly coming back to them, even expressing that sometimes they would go to other tutors just so that they could eventually go back to this. So as you can see, Figly tutors bridge the spaces between writing centers and low-income first-generation and working-class students through their unique adaptivity and flexibility rooted in their own experiences when they work with Figly students.
Through circumnavigating university expectations and academic preparedness, Figly Tutors create spaces where Figly experiences are standard, ultimately working to foster sustained pipelines where Figly students become involved with and use writing centers.
And in terms of what these implications look like for Georgetown's Writing Center here, we're hoping to take those three operations we talked about in our first research question, hiring, training, and tutoring, and continue to focus the initiatives we've already started throughout the rest of the school year.
To connect back to what Daniela mentioned and our presentations we've had over the summer and seeing an increase in Figly clients just within the past month. In terms of hiring, we were able to successfully recruit a Figly tutor this cycle who found out about the Writing Center through our initiative of outreach to GSP Direct. And lastly, in terms of training, the work that we're doing here today is now officially part of the training curriculum for Writing Center tutors. Additionally, I'm one of the TAs for the new cohort of tutors, so we're hoping that we continue to have these conversations and make them a normal part of our Writing Center. Thank you.
Thank you, Jasmine and Daniela. Our final panelist this morning, Joshua Gabsey, is a Provost Distinguished Undergraduate Research Fellow. This fellowship is designed to enhance student engagement in rigorous scholarly research. Students who are accepted into this competitive fellowship program are the most highly rated applicants to the center's 3 summer research programs. Joshua.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for coming. I will be presenting my research titled Beyond Kind Words and Core Values, Analyzing the Consistency Between Corporate Statements on COVID-19 and Their Labor Practices. Before I begin, I'd like to thank the Center for Research and Fellowships for sponsoring my research over the summer and the staff I worked with, including Lauren, Bill, and Jonathan. And I'd also like to give a special shout out to Professor Fields, who not only mentored me throughout this research, but sparked my interest in sociological research a little over 2 years ago. The COVID-19 pandemic dramatically transformed labor relations across the country. For the first time in decades, employers, communities, and governments all started rallying around the idea of essential workers and the importance of their laborers in everything that they do. Despite this attention, surge in worker strikes and union organizing indicated that dissatisfaction among workers was at an all-time high. This is supported by research produced by Cornell University's School of Industrial and Labor Relations, which found that the average number of workers on strikes by the end of 2021 rose from 10,000 to 25,000, and data from the National Labor Relations Board, which found that by the end of 2022, unfair labor practice charges had increased by 19% and union representation petitions increased by 22%. Given the discontinuity between this attention and those statistics, this research is motivated by thinking about how corporate voice aligns with corporate action. Specifically, my research asks the question, what is the relationship between the statements released by Fortune 500 corporations in response to COVID-19 and the labor practices of these firms? Specifically, are stronger statements associated with better working conditions? The data for this study came from an analysis of Fortune 500 COVID-19 response statements. That includes the earliest example that we could find from press releases, investor statements, social media posts, or general web pages that were created to disseminate information about their COVID-19 responses. However, it excluded statements which were read as post-COVID statements that talked about what they were doing after the pandemic with regard to vaccinations and return to work. And it also excluded decentralized web pages where information was scattered across multiple sources. The labor statistics that were gathered all begin from 2020 to indicate how they changed throughout the pandemic. And that includes NLRB data about unfair labor practice charges, union representation petitions, median salary of the firms, a ratio of the CEO salary to the median employee salary, information about whether employees went on strikes or took other forms of protest, and then LM20 forms, which is a document that firms submit to the Department of Labor if they hire union busting consultants. In order to determine whether there was a relationship between the quality of the statement and the quality of their labor practices, I conducted a content analysis of each statements where I developed a coding scheme that designed to look at the audience of the statement, the actions taken, and the values that I identified as motivating those actions, in addition to a bunch of other factors. And then those statements were categorized by content into 4 categories. Category 1 includes statements where they spoke directly to workers and took actions which affected them. Category 2 includes statements which spoke directly to workers but didn't take action. Category 3 includes statements where they didn't speak directly to workers but did announce actions which affect them. And category 4 is for statements that didn't speak to their workers or didn't describe any actions which affect their employees. They were also categorized by economic sector to think about if firms in different industries had different relationships to their employees. Down below, you can see an example of what some of these statements look like from Walmart, CVS, and Starbucks, usually in the form of direct messages from CEOs or more vague statements from corporate writers. In order to determine whether there was a relationship between the two, I'm currently working on a regression analysis that could be used to determine a correlation between the quality of statements and the labor practices. But in the meantime, we have some averages that should be able to hint at those relationships. Some of the initial findings for how I was able to gather these statements show that 362 Fortune 500 corporations released public statements about their response to the pandemic. 109 were unable to be found. That doesn't mean that they weren't released. It might mean that they're not private, or that they're private, not publicly accessible, or that they've been updated since the start of the pandemic to reflect post-COVID concerns. Additionally, there were 29 statements that were collected, but were presented in a way like a video or a more scattered web page that didn't neatly fit the coding scheme, so they weren't included for the sake of this project. The statement categorization was interesting, however. It broke down extremely evenly across categories 1, 3, and 4, with a very small percentage, 2.5% in category 2. This means that 128 statements, or about 35.4%, directly spoke to employees, while 237, 65.4%, took action on their behalf, even if they didn't speak to employees. Again, a regression analysis is being conducted to determine what the actual relationship between these statements is, but the averages of the statements show a lot about that in the meantime. So before I start going through some of this, it's worth noting that because the statements in category 2 were such a small number, they're very heavily affected by outliers. For example, Starbucks is a category 2 company, and since January 1st, 2020, they've had 732 unfair labor practice charges filed against the NLRB, which explains why the average is so high from 53 and explains the necessity for a regression analysis. However, it is worth noting that section 4 or category 4 outperformed both 1 and 3 in almost every regard. So statements which didn't speak to the employees or directly announce actions taken which affect employees ended up being associated with better labor practices. As you can see, category 4 has an average median wage that's higher than both 1 and 3 by around $12,000 and $20,000 respectively. And corporations in category 4 were much less likely to experience worker strikes than the other two, were at 18 and 28% respectively. That is very, very interesting because it indicates that higher statements could be correlated with worse labor practices because these companies are aware of that and are overcompensating and feel the need to justify their policies on a public scale, which is why they put so much effort into crafting these statements and making sure that it reflects a specific identity about them. This is an important finding, not only to better understand the function of communication and rhetoric when it comes to public statements, but for corporate accountability and understanding that the information that these corporations release about their behaviors and their actions is not always indicative of what is actually happening behind the scenes. Another initial finding that was relevant to discuss here is the value statements that were cited by each of the corporations. 148 statements specify that health and safety is a key value. That's about 40.9% of them. However, only 29.7% of these statements exclusively reference employees, 4.7% exclusively reference other stakeholders, including investors, customers, or their communities. 84 reference employees in addition to other stakeholders, and 13 of them do not specify a stakeholder and hold health and safety as a general value. 202 didn't specify anything, and 12 specified something else entirely, which could include customer satisfaction, financial performance, or a host of other values. It's important to think about how these actions may align with the values that are taken, and one of the research questions currently being asked and currently trying to be answered is determining whether the employee statements that specified health and safety actually took actions which aligned with these practices. Realistically, there's still a decent amount that needs to be done to determine whether or not the quality of the statements can predict the quality of labor practices, and further data analysis is still necessary. We're hoping to have a regression table released in the next few weeks that can use to find a correlation between the quality of each and make more predictive statements about what's happening. There's also a breakdown of actions taken, which is very important. Easier actions to take, like work from home, social distancing, providing PPE, tended to dominate a lot of these statements and were much, much more common. However, direct financial support for employees was much less common. It was very rare to see statements specify that they would continue to provide wages even if they terminated their operations. And it was even more unlikely that they would specify that they're increasing paid time off, expanding benefits, providing healthcare, or doing anything to meaningfully support the health and safety of their employees, which is a problematic concern given that around 50% of them specified that employee health and safety was a key value driving their actions. It's also worth thinking about the unionization data, which is much harder to collect. There could be a lot of intervening variables that affect the quality of employee performance and employee protections, one of which is whether or not they're unionized, which is why we've collected union representation data for the NLRB. Unfortunately, it's a little bit difficult to read that data. A high number of union representation petitions could indicate that workers are more in need of a union, but lower numbers could also indicate that higher numbers can also indicate that there's less union busting, which would be a good thing. So that data should be taken with a grain of salt, but there's still a lot more to be learned about the nature of these practices, the way that they work, and what they reveal about the corporations who write them. Despite listing health and safety as one of their primary concerns, another key thing that emerged in an analysis of these statements was the financial focus. There were a high number of statements that didn't speak to employees. This is primarily in category 4, that only speak to their investors and are focused on the financial continuity of their operations, which is also very telling, despite the fact that all of these actions influence their employees and meaningfully affect their ability to do their jobs. However, they're ignored in favor of focus on the financial status of the companies and their ability to continue. So the overall relationship between voice and action depends on the specific variable that's being analyzed. But as of now, it does seem that there is a relationship between higher quality statements and lower quality labor practices, which I'm hoping to confirm as I do further analysis and regression tables. Thank you.
Thank you, Joshua. We have time for questions now for those in the room. If you'll raise your hand, we'll bring a mic to you. And for those on Zoom, we will we'll read aloud questions in the chat. Or maybe we will not have a mic. We will not have a mic. We will ask you to be very loud. I see one here. Why
I
don't you
can
go
speak
ahead?
loudly.
Yep.
I'll put my laptop down first. Amazing, wonderful, really well done, all of you. I'm following in your footsteps here. I have separate questions for everybody, but they can be short. For the two more qualitative sides of things, I'm really interested in what the work that you do looks like if it's contextually appropriate. So in the Ghanaian context, what does providing mental health services look like? And how would that be different than this Western model that we're all very familiar with? For the writing center, I love the McChicken essay example. I don't know what that means. So I would love, what does it look like when those services are provided in a actually appropriate way? And then, or quantitatively, for your regression model or for the research that you're doing, are you looking at any explanatory variables for these corporations? Like what types of products do they provide? What is their model of board leadership? And then also maybe tax data, because we're seeing a lot of corporations moving toward, oh, they're not actually employees, they're consultants. So are you thinking about including any of that?
So I think Dr. Annabella Osei Tutu, the keynote speaker at the professional seminar, summed this up pretty well, but in Ghana, religion is a huge aspect of life. So her research focused on collaborating with spiritual leaders to help people make more like religiously and scientifically informed therapeutic services available to the public. So it doesn't necessarily look like, just like sitting in, well, I mean, they do have, regular therapy and psychiatric medications and things like that. But the way that you go about providing those services to people has to be a little bit more sensitive, because a lot of people aren't very trusting of medical professionals. They find a lot more solace and comfort in religious leaders. So I think it looks like taking into account people's spiritual beliefs, their values, and kind of gently pushing in the science as opposed to shoving it in your face like the way we do in the West. Thanks.
So in regards to what this service looks like for Big Blue students within learning centers that's more tailored to them, we found, especially when reading research from one of the researchers we drew a lot of inspiration from, Harry Denny, there's mainly two parts to this. So the first part is tutors should not be making assumptions about what students do or should know. We shouldn't really be assuming that there's a baseline for anything, so that you're more willing and able to come up with an idea like in the chicken essay to explain something that might seem basic to you but not to someone else. And then the second part is not having this attitude that you know what's best for the tutor, for the client, so not taking full control in terms of, I don't really think their concerns are the right concerns that they have for this paper. I think there are other concerns that are more important. That's coming from my perspective and not really.
I think to add on to that, in terms of what that looks like within sessions, an example is that as tutors, we're taught how to talk about thesis statements, but we're often not taught how to explain what a thesis statement is. And there's nothing wrong with not knowing what a thesis statement is at this university, right? But I think recognizing that students come with these different concerns and it is all valid. And it's not by any means any less than to not know what a thesis statement is and to know how to work with that. And then I think in terms of also the emotional aspect of that, tutors are often taught non-directive strategies. So basically asking people questions of like, what do you think about this? And in our work with our own Big Blue peers, you realize no one likes that because they're like, and actually one of our quotes from one of our interviewees was talking about how, they can't just find the answer within their heart. And it really does come to like being able to, yes, non-directive strategies may work well for some clients, but for other clients, let's just not ask, like beat around the bush because it doesn't help them, right? And there's nothing wrong with adapting and tailoring and changing what we view as correct pedagogy for that.
I think one final part of it is also just recognizing Big Blue students, not just approaching Big Blue students from a division oriented standpoint, but also recognizing that there's so many valuable insights, ideas, creativity that these students are bringing to the university life in general, that people should be actively drawing upon, being curious about, asking about, that should start to get incorporated into their learning.
So thank you for your question. Regarding the first part about controlling variables, the two that I'm looking at the most are first, the sector. It seems that businesses with more public relations necessary kind of approaches, whether it be dining or retail, where you have to interact with customers more, we're more concerned with an increased focus on the language that they use, emphasizing the values of their companies, the protections that they're going to enact for employees and customers, while more industrial materials producers, for example, that don't really interact with customers who aren't corporations buying their products, seem to be focused much more on operational concerns and financial challenges that were relevant to their business. I think another interesting factor that's worth looking at that could indicate a lot of these relationships is employee unionization. However, that data is a little bit more difficult to collect because there are a handful of Fortune 500 companies that are really just a bunch of subsidiaries of smaller companies, some of which may be unionized, others maybe not, which also complicated some of the data that I collected because individual subsidiaries might release their own statements about their practices and their concerns and their operations, but they may not be reflective of the overall corporation. And the second part about other relevant characteristics, I appreciated that question. I think using a sample of Fortune 500 companies gets at it a little bit since it represents 500 largest revenue companies in the United States. the specific question you asked about tax breaks and like classification of workers is well represented in the study. For example, Uber has a lot of debates with their staff about whether they should be classified as employees or independent contractors, and that's true for a lot of Fortune 500 corporations. So we are hoping that those concerns are reflected by the large sample size that were included in the study.
Take another one from the room and then maybe we'll go to the chat in the back.
This is actually a question from.
Oh, sorry, in the
Zoom
chat. Yeah,
if
that's
that's
great.
all right.
Sure.
For the Rains Fellows. Jacob Mendel asks, how do you think your conclusions could generalize to other student services or other populations?
I think it comes back to not assuming what a standard student is and being able to meet them where they're at, even if that means going and straying away from what you think you're supposed to do.
And then back here, yep.
Hi, my question is for Nandi. What are the like generational gaps that you found in your research? And especially in like your site visit and talking with like the youth representatives?
I think for like the undergrads and graduate students, I found that a lot of the issues that they face are similar to the ones that we face. Like, it was pretty comforting to realize that being a stressed out college student is a universal experience. And then in terms of older people, I think they were the ones who held some of those more antiquated views on mental illness, like the possession aspect, or that, you know, mental illness is the result of your ancestors punishing you for something bad you did. I think that because of honestly social media, younger people have more modern, up-to-date views on mental illness. So I think that was the biggest gap I found.
Other questions? Yeah, here.
So for the Jasmine and Danielle, I had a question. Maybe more mistake than a question, so I apologize. But I'll try to break this a question. So to what extent did you find that the writing centers understood themselves as like teaching students both how to write, but also how to sort of navigate a social context that's different from what they grew up in, right? So like, and I guess to what extent with changing what the writing center does alter the balance between those two things, right? Because you might say, well, yes, the point of course is to make sure people know how to write a good essay, but it's also by asking, what do you think about this, which is eye-rolling, but also like gives you practice with moving through the upper class network where like everyone seems to give a shit about what you think about something. So you need to know how to talk about that. So I guess I'm wondering, to what extent do you think that, you know, writing centers have to balance this sort of speaking to people where they are while also cluing people into this sort of new world to you?
That's a really good question. I think that there definitely is like a balance that needs to be struck. I think obviously like part of like adjusting to a new cultural environment that you might not be used to, like depending on how you grew up, is in part practice. So just sort of like being in the environment, seeing how people speak, adopting those ways of speaking. But I also think, especially in terms of the Writing Center as a resource that just explicitly advertising it itself as like a place where it can meet students where they're at. I think considering having more explicit conversations about the sort of like hidden aspects of navigating university life is something that we should consider more. I'm thinking of one of our interviews with a tutor who was part of a program where she had like long-term mentoring with big new clients, and she mentioned that she wished having a discussion about like the more like I guess meta aspects of being a university student, or even more just like the idea that like professor expectations, for example, can vary in each class, was being had more. So I think like it is in part practice, but it's also in part just like explicitly making this known that like there's this whole expectation about what a student should be doing and knowing that we might not be aware of due to our backgrounds.
Yeah, and I think, oh gosh, I love this question because I could probably talk about this for hours. Genuinely ask us and we will talk about this for hours. But I think it ultimately also comes down to agency in that, right, giving students as tutors to recognize, hey, professors might expect this. You can choose to not do that and to stay in how you want to authentically present yourself. Just know that this is the professor's expectation. And giving tutees the agency to choose how they navigate that. And I think it also comes down to us being prepared to meet these expectations. Because in our literature review, we're looking at a lot of the data that has been published is about Figly experiences as clients. And so Figly students come to the Writing Center as a resource, thinking it is going to help them understand this hidden curriculum of universities. Like, what does it mean to write a college paper? We had in our literature review, there was students who thought that there was this like college essay genre. And we know that is not true, right? But they were coming to writing centers thinking, okay, like how do I write a college paper, right? And tutors were not prepared to deal with that because they were like, okay, well, what is that? Like they just weren't prepared to deal with that at all, right? So I think as writing centers, it's recognizing what are the concerns that Figly students might come from, especially if they are seeking to use the Writing Center as a way to familiarize themselves with standard university expectations. And then also giving duties, agency to choose as clients.
So I really like how in each of your responses to our questions from our audience so far, it's been kind of like looking at assumptions and testing them and really exploring like what's going on here, what's at stake. I'm so very interested in how you as researchers come to each of your projects with, hypotheses and assumptions. And so I'd like to extend that and ask each of you to talk a little bit about what you found maybe most surprising in doing your work. So you come in with assumptions about what it is you might find. But what was it potentially after having done it? Do you think, well, that was really surprising, where maybe your assumption that you went in with was disabused? Josh, can we start with you or?
Yeah.
Okay.
While I was conducting my research, it was very hard to see the relationship between quality of statement and quality of practice. Then again, I was going one by one for 362 statements. So I would do Amazon's and be like, oh, great. Well, they said all these things and they're doing all these things. And I'd read something like Starbucks, which was in category 2, was a lot emptier, didn't take action. So I kind of figured there would be no meaningful relationship between quality of statement and quality of actions, i.e. corporations would say what they want and then do what they want, regardless of whether that aligns. I was a little bit surprised to see the averages showing that category 4 statements, which don't speak to employees or don't act on their behalf, far outperformed 1 and 3. And I do think that's an important finding, given the fact it can indicate that these corporations, are not only aware of their public perception, Amazon and Starbucks, for example, but are actively willing to overcompensate with that in their statements and manipulate the way that they talk about their employees as such, even though they don't align with the way that they treat their employees.
Back to the question about the biggest generational gaps, the thing I found most surprising was, again, just like how much I had in common with people who were around my age. I think a lot of the times when we think about Africa, we think of this very distant foreign land that, people ride lions to go to school and things like that. Like, Africa has, major cities and metropolitan areas. It also has rural areas. And I think that one of the biggest things that shocked me was that, a college student is a college student, no matter where you are in the world. There are, a few cultural differences that kind of tweak that, but, feeling lonely, feeling depressed, feeling anxious, these are human universal experiences.
I think coming into this, we were heavily influenced by our lived experience. We thought like, do other people have similar experiences? And in interviews, I think the thing that even in our first interview, like it shocked me how Figly tutors were adapting to what research currently says that Figly clients want, right? Talking about, they were doing the more directive strategies. They were taking on and creating the McChicken essay, right? And they didn't know, they hadn't read this research, they were just doing it. And I think in our conversations, in our interviews, we were very active about talking and expressing that like, you're doing crazy work. Like you should be so proud of yourself, because even the interviews we did have, they were like, oh, I wish we could be doing more. I don't know that this is really that impressive. This is just what I do. And to recognize that like these tutors were acting like autonomously in just the way that aligns with research, it was like genuinely like, I think that was probably one of my favorite moments to come to that conclusion and be like, well, like not only is there something here, but like Figly tutors, we know what we're doing. And like that was like genuinely one of my favorite parts of this project.
Yeah, I would definitely just echo that statement. It was pretty shocking, like especially our first interview, just like how she was like, naturally bringing up all topics. And also just the sort of lack of self-awareness and that like people, like the tutors we interviewed a lot of times, they didn't realize that they were doing such great work and that people were doing things that wasn't effective for clients. It was just sort of like, I realized that this wasn't gonna work, so I did something else. So I think that was something that was.
We go back to the audience for questions. I think one here and yeah, right here.
I have two questions, one for Jasmine and Daniela, and one for Joshua. For Jasmine and Daniela, I was wondering, I think this was the same across the writing page that you were looking at, that there were peer-to-peer models with the tutors and tutees. I was wondering, do you think there are any implications in the fact that it was peer-to-peer and not like professor to student? I know you mentioned like a really big important dynamic was that older FGLI students kind of like took other Figley students under their wing. Or like help them with the pipeline into being tutors, but I'm just wondering, like, in general, at the writing center structure, how you felt like peer-to-peer model like affected the dynamic.
I think one aspect that was critical that in our like literature and stuff, it definitely does have benefits as we saw in our interviews, but also it might create some within clients that the person who I'm receiving help from isn't actually that knowledgeable. So I think it was surprising to read that one of the sort of like ways the Writing Center fell short was in providing this like absolute authoritative figure for Figley clients that they were looking for, possibly because they felt like they needed someone to tell them exactly what was going on, even though there obviously are benefits to having someone you can be more honest with about your struggles.
I think that was, in terms of what we're taught as Writing Center tutors, right? The peer-to-peer model that has so many benefits that we see with all of our clients, the idea of being vulnerable. Yeah, like Noah was saying, the idea that maybe instead of just constantly presenting ourselves as, you know, hey, we're just like you were students. I mean, we are trained. And I think with Figley clients, we also, that is something we know that we want to address, because often we've talked to Figley clients here who are like, okay, but like, you don't have anyone who specializes in my major or whatnot. And then we're like, don't worry, like we all work with philosophy essays. We can do a philosophy paper, you know, in 30 minutes realistically. So just recognizing that like, in some ways, the peer-to-peer model of the Writing Center has so many benefits for all of our clients, but then also recognizing the opportunities for adapting this to Figley needs regarding quantitative approaches to tutoring.
Sorry, my other question for Joshua. I know you said that like you couldn't code, or it was really difficult to code like video statements and like other statements that aren't exactly the same, like the ones you were examining. I was wondering like if you were to modify like the way you were conducting your research to include videos, like do you think that would be possible to still code them, or are they just like too wide ranging where it would be difficult to code them, or like how do you feel like the video aspect like affects the research question?
Yeah, I had referenced videos. They only appeared in 2, maybe 3 of the statements, if I remember correctly. So I don't think it would have a terribly different implication on the data that I collected, but they were a lot longer and drawn out. And usually if there was a video released, it was about much broader claims about the firm's commitment to health and safety, not specifically in the context of COVID. The statements that I collected, what I tried to do was get a specific time frame that they were all reacting within. So most of the statements range from the end of February, beginning of March, to at the latest end of May, beginning of June. And the statements with videos that I found were after that, and kind of like recaps, like here's what we did throughout all of 2020. And those statements read a lot differently. One, because a lot of the earlier statements are all kind of unified by this uncertainty about what's going to happen, while a lot of the post-COVID statements and some of the videos were a lot like, here's what's already happened, and they have a much more clear idea of how they can talk about what they did for their employees. I think it was more telling with the firms at the beginning who didn't have those kinds of considerations, as opposed to when you're looking back and you'd be like, oh, well, everyone cares about essential workers. Let's talk about our workforce too.
Thank you.
I really appreciated Jasmine and Daniela and Nandy, how you talked about how you came to your research. You know, you had personal experience. Nandy, I loved how you said you found this group, the Blessed Research Group, right? And so Josh, I'm eager how you got to yours. Like, what, did you take a class? Is it, you know, something, a footnote of a book somewhere, just your own COVID experience? I'd love to know that.
Thank you. Yeah, I'd say there were two experiences that really motivated me to pursue this research. One is the work that I'm currently doing with Professor Fields. We're working on a project that analyzes the difference between statements about COVID-19 and Black Lives Matter and racial injustice. Let's talk about the different ways that corporations, nonprofits, and universities describe their relationships to those things. So I had a lot of experience with reading some of these corporate COVID-19 statements, and there was a lot that I was thinking while reading them that didn't really jive with me, where I'm like, does Amazon, Starbucks, John Deere, Kellogg, all of these firms who have experienced massive strike waves over the last few months, what really is their commitment to health and safety? And then second, the other thing that motivated me to pursue this research is one of the other things on campus that I'm really committed to is the Georgetown Coalition for Workers' Rights. We're a group of undergraduates dedicated to protecting and expanding workers' rights on campus. And I get very frustrated in that experience dealing with Georgetown's emphasis on Jesuit values, which don't always show in its treatment of employees. And I'm incredibly thankful for the opportunities that Georgetown has given me to talk about those things, but I do think that that should be equally extended to the people that work here and allow us to do it.
Awesome, thank you. Can I ask another question, Dr. Tuckley? I would love to hear from you all. You know, one reason we do this symposium is so that other Hoyas can see themselves up there sitting at that table next year, right? And so what is it that prompted you to, right, apply for a research fellowship, or what advice would you give to a fellow Hoya who might be thinking, I don't know, is that me or is that not? What is the first step you might suggest they take?
So I found the Blessed Research Group through the psychology listserv and the psychology research listserv. And I am just in general a very anxious person. So when I got to Georgetown, I was like, I need to have all these extracurriculars so I can get into all the things I want to get into after. So just apply to every opportunity you see. Professors want to work with students. That's why they're professors. And there are so many cool research projects happening here at Georgetown. There is sure to be your very specific niche, there's somebody here studying it. So just whatever you see that piques your interest, even if you don't see someone who's advertising a formal undergraduate research assistantship, email professors and be like, hey, can I help you with anything at all? Do you want any students to help you? Blah, blah, blah. You can do it for free, or getting paid is better, but if you just want to get your foot in the door, you can say, I'll do it for free, and then maybe they'll pay you later. But just apply to everything.
What I would say, and I think this is especially demonstrated by the projects that both the other panelists presented, is that research matters. If there's something that you see that bothers you and you want to talk more about it and criticize it, if you see something that excites you and you want to amplify it, research is a really good platform to not only do that, but to have a statistical or qualitative argument that backs it up, ties it to broader arguments being made by other scholars in the field. And it's important to take a lot of these things down from academia. It's important to cite some of these academic articles and theories to understand a lot of these problems, but they have material implications on people's lives beyond that. And conducting the kind of research that the other panelists conducted, and something that I tried to get at as well, is showing people that this stuff isn't just reserved for those kind of ivory tower conversations. It can meaningfully impact people's lives, their perceptions of the forces and structures around them, and influence the way that they move through those systems.
I think my biggest advice would be to visit the Writing Center. But I think in all seriousness, I think something we were really committed to is working with the very specific niche thing that is first-gen low-income identities at the Writing Center. I mean, papers only started getting published on this topic in 2017. This is a very emerging field. And so we were often okay, well, what does that look like for us navigating this? Unsure of what research looks like to begin with, and then also trying to dive into this very specific thing. And I think something that I've learned throughout the process is how much connections with others really helps the process, and that, right, working with people who, other Writing Center tutors or Writing Center directors, other people who may not be as familiar with our specific field, And even like the Rains Fellows, I think did a really good job of highlighting areas for connection and learning from each other. In that like, just because, you know, you don't have someone who is like, has done your specific thing and knows exactly what you're doing, doesn't mean that they can't contribute more, by giving and finding connections amongst, research as a whole.
So I would definitely echo what everybody was, what they said, and I would also say like, it's like, if you are considering applying, it's okay to be scared of applying, it's okay to not know exactly what you're doing yet. And you might have this idea that everyone knows exactly, and maybe that's true, but that definitely was not true for us. It was definitely like a learning project from day one. But it still is a valuable process, like learning and doing at the same time. And just because you don't have the background that you think everyone else has, doesn't mean that you should let that stop you from beginning to build that.